unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grand Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan. How and why did Hindu nationalism become popular among India's diaspora after India's independence in 1947? This is the central question of Hindu nationalism in the Indian diaspora, transnational politics, and British multiculturalism, a 2023 book by the historian Edward Anderson. The book interrogates the distinctive resonance Hindutva ideology has overseas and the multiple ways in which the diaspora engages with British politics and society, while also sustaining connections back home. Edward is assistant professor in history at Northumbria University in Newcastle. He was previously the Smuts Research Fellow in Commonwealth Studies at the University of Cambridge, where he obtained his PhD in history. To talk more about his book and the unique role that the diaspora plays abroad, Ed joins me on the show for the very first time. Ed, congrats on the book, and so great to have you on the show.
Thanks very much. It's lovely to talk to you.
So, Ed, you and I have been in touch for some time. I as I was discussing before we joined, I sort of skimmed your book when I first got a copy of it, but just had the chance to kind of go through it cover to cover. And it's really a fascinating, I think, pretty unique look at how the diaspora functions, particularly as it relates to kind of, politics and developments back home. The central question that you ask, if I could kind of boil it down, is, why did Hindu nationalism become so popular and influential among the diaspora, particularly after the kind of independence moment? Now, most of this conversation is going to be spent getting into the answers to that question, but I just want to stick with the question itself for a moment. Tell us a little bit about what inspired you to dig into this question about the diaspora.
Well, I lived and studied actually in India for a few years after my first undergraduate degree. And I just found the history and the culture and the politics of the place absolutely fascinating. It's it's an amazing part of the world and I love it very dearly. And this was actually quite a long time before the 2014 pivotal election. And in fact, the BJP and the Hindu Nationalist movement more broadly were in a very different position at this time. In fact, India itself was very different in many senses to how it is today. And at this point in time, I think, I was aware, of course, of a very substantial Indian diaspora and, the enormous influence of this diaspora and Indian culture on Britain, where I come from. And I was also at this point interested in Hindu nationalism and in, other expressions of right-wing ethnic nationalist politics. And so it was when I realized that those two kind of intersected that I became very curious indeed. And I think, to begin with, I was struck by a couple of tensions or even paradoxes that are quite commonly raised. The first and most obvious one is, why is it that people who have chosen to move abroad or whose origins to India are separated by generations, why is it that these people are sometimes the most staunchly patriotic or even chauvinistic, claiming to be the proudest Indians? This is a kind of classic tension of long-distance nationalism as posited by Benedict Anderson. And the second tension that people have kind of raised, which, is a bit more complicated, is why would people support an indigenous majoritarian ideology applied to one country whilst negotiating recognition and minority rights in another? So a lot of people have suggested that this is a sort of absurd or paradoxical situation, but I was really keen to try and delve into these questions a bit more deeply and to really try and make sense about why it's developed in popularity and influence from the second half of the 20th century and what it is about this ideology that appeals to Indians living outside India.
So, Ed, I was struck by some of the data that you compile in your book, and I just want to give our listeners kind of one mini snapshot. In 1971, you write that Britain was home to about 140,000 or so Hindus in just 2 temples. And if you fast forward to 2021, there were more than 1 million Hindus and 187 temples, right? So pretty astonishing growth over this 5-decade period. For a layperson, how would you characterize the kind of successive waves of Indian migration to Britain after independence?
That growth over the second half of the 20th century is certainly striking, and the stats that you mentioned illustrate that. But the first point to make is that Indian migration to Britain long predates independence. Of course, Britain has had a colonial relationship with India since the very beginning of the 17th century, and throughout the period of British imperial rule over India, that there were people coming in the other direction. But something does change significantly in the wake of decolonization. It's a complex story, but there are two kind of particularly significant moments. One is in 1948, and Britain at this point passes the British Nationality Act. And this creates a new legal status of a citizen of the United Kingdom and colonies. And essentially, the consequence is that all citizens of the British Empire and the Commonwealth could move to and work freely in the UK. And this is, almost a quarter of the world's population. This was probably an unintended consequence, and obviously the kind of politics of that still reverberate to this day. But it also suited Britain because Britain was trying to rebuild following the Second World War. There were labour shortages. The Labour government was trying to put together the welfare state. 1948 also sees the establishment of the NHS. And so this gives rise to, a period of mass migration to Britain, initially with the Windrush era of that kind of generation of Caribbean migrants to Britain from the late 40s onwards. And then from the 50s and after that, many people moved from South Asia to Britain. And the other thing that's happening at the same time, of course, is in the wake of decolonization is partition. This is a period of massive rupture, dislocation, and a lot of people are looking to start a new life for themselves outside the Indian subcontinent. And so we see, in that early period, a significant number of people moving from Punjab, in particular, and Bengal as well, over to the West and to Britain. And that was facilitated by the law that I just mentioned. The US, on the other hand, was much more restrictive until the 1960s, up until which point there were kind of national origin bars and quotas and so on. So from the 50s and 60s, there's a significant emigration of Indians to Britain. And then there's another big shift that takes place in the sort of late 60s and early 70s, when a very substantial number of people of Indian origin move to the UK and other parts of the world from East Africa during this kind of wave of decolonization in Africa and after it. And many people are kind of coerced out of the countries in which they live in East Africa, places like Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda. And in the case of Uganda, more than coerced, they're forced to leave in 1972. So that's another, big sort of moment in the kind of changing demography of the UK, I suppose.
One of the central claims of the book is that global Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, is often the product of kind of two things going on simultaneously, right? You have strategies of domestic expansion in which kind of diaspora groups are growing, are building, are expanding. But you also have sustained coordination and support from India. And I feel like, the first story is a little bit more obvious to us than the second one. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of offer just a brief sketch of how diaspora activities in Britain are coordinated from afar, particularly when you're looking at groups that are part of the kind of global Hindutva movement.
This is a kind of much debated question, and depending on who you ask, you'll get rather different answers. So on the one hand, certain people suggest that Hindutva or Hindu nationalist groups outside India are entirely organic. They are grassroots. On the other hand, some people suggest that Hindu nationalism is a kind of export from India. It's something that's entirely coordinated or supplanted, and that Hindu nationalist groups are just sort of overseas wings of the same organisation. The truth, as is often the case in these sorts of issues, is a bit murkier, a bit more nebulous, somewhere in between. So yeah, I do try and explore the extent to which Hindutva outside India is coordinated. I mean, I think the first point I should make is that I certainly don't suggest that all diasporic Hindutva is the product of coordination. And actually, it's clear that a lot of it does occur in kind of organic ways. It's often dependent on proactive and very committed individuals who are doing a lot of the kind of heavy lifting and organising of a wide range of groups. And actually, certain individuals are often involved in multiple organisations, and these groups often end up giving the impression of being actually more dynamic and maybe more popular than they really are. So these kind of key players are often very important. So there is a sort of degree of separateness, and actually the Hindutva groups themselves are often quite keen to emphasise the separateness. And this may be strategic. I mean, it's worth remembering that a lot of overseas groups are registered as charities or non-profits. And, generally speaking, I'm a little bit, it's hard to get to the bottom of that exactly, but certainly, I mentioned earlier that some sort of refer to these groups as simply being kind of exports or transplanted. And I think that doesn't quite capture how dynamic or syncretic they can be. That being said, there are clear layers and structures of coordination and influence without question. So the RSS, for instance, they have an office called the Vishwa Vibhag, which is concerned specifically with the activities of the Sangh and its members outside of India, in the diaspora. The same is the case for other groups. Another form of influence would be through individuals being sort of sent abroad. You have pracharaks, full-time workers of the RSS that are kind of coordinating activities in various parts of the world. And also another sort of maybe a less sort of systematic thing might be that various figures in the Hindu nationalist movement frequently conduct overseas tours. I mean, of course, politicians are usually the most high profile and conspicuous aspects of that, but we also have other Sangh leaders, activists, preachers, and all sorts of others that travel overseas and help that sort of coordination, as it were. And then another form of coordination, another layer to that coordination, would be people going in the other direction. So people that are based in the US, based in Britain, based in Australia, wherever it might be, returning to India and taking part in events and camps, for example. So that's another way in which influence can be sort of transmitted. Of course, travel isn't required. Digital technologies today mean that people can be influenced and coordinated, instantly and, all the time, really. That being said, I've sort of one other kind of final point, I guess, a rather academic point to make is that, it's not always helpful to think necessarily just about binaries of India versus diaspora. And when you start thinking about coordination from the homeland, there is that kind of, one might end up thinking about sort of the binary of India versus diaspora. But actually, I think it's useful to think in a much more sort of transnational way about these sorts of ideologies and movements.
So I want to kind of circle back, Ed, to something that you said earlier when you were kind of describing the successive waves of Indian migration to Great Britain. One of the very interesting facts you point out in your book is that the very first official shaka, which is, of course, these critical kind of hubs of RSS activity, the very first RSS overseas shaka was set up in January of 1947 in Nairobi, Kenya, of all places. And, from a British perspective, East African emigration was an important catalyst for the growth of diaspora organizations, especially Hindu nationalist groups. And I wonder if we could just pause there for a second and have you tell us, what's the kind of nature of the nexus between Hindutva in East Africa? Why did that particular channel emerge as such a powerful one?
Yes, it's an interesting fact that I think perhaps quite a lot of people aren't aware of. I suppose to answer this question, it might be worth just giving a little bit of sort of historical context. So, there has been an Asian population, a South Asian population, that is, in East Africa, since really in a significant on a significant scale since the end of the 19th century. And at this point, East Africa or parts of East Africa were part of the British Empire, particularly the countries of Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And then from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, the British were quite keen to encourage migration of Indians over to East Africa to participate in various aspects of the economy. They were provided with certain positions, even in the administration, the bureaucracy, and also certain sort of trading privileges that were denied to the African population. And also they were also brought in for the various sort of skills that they possessed, including contributing towards the construction of the railway in Uganda. So there's this growing East African Asian population across the whole of the 20th century. And, this is a population that remained quite closely connected to India. There's travel over the ocean back to India. There is also, quite a sort of segregated community as well, quite tight-knit communities, often quite kind of tight-knit in terms of their own sort of social makeup, particularly large numbers of people emigrating there from Gujarat, for example. And there's this desire to remain connected, and they had their own schools, they had their own community groups, and so that's the kind of context under which the first shaka of the RSS is established. And there's this almost sort of apocryphal or legendary story of it being set up partly through this kind of chance meeting that takes place on a ship traveling over to Kenya. And then, in the mid-1940s, the first shaka is established. And from that point onwards, it grows quite sort of quickly. Lots and lots of people from, particularly Gujarati Hindu communities in East Africa are affiliated with shakas. Their children are involved. It's a way of kind of, socializing. They obviously do sort of recreational activities, sporting activities, but also, maintaining that cultural sort of connection as well. And then the sort of pivotal moment for global Hindutva, in a sense, comes in the 60s and 70s when these countries have gained independence and are quite eager for the Asian population to leave, or actually, sort of in the case of Idi Amin, forcibly expelling the Asian population. And so a lot of these groups and networks that have been established in East Africa are then taken with them to Britain and to other parts of the world as well. And we can see very clearly in the makeup of a lot of Hindu nationalist groups, particularly in the sort of second half of the 20th century. I think things have changed to some extent, but certainly a lot of those groups initially are almost entirely East African Asian in makeup.
One of the things that you say about the shaka is that it has been the chief means of growth, of organization, activity, ideological inculcation, and training for the Sangh. And, it kind of brought to mind this question about, whether and how shakas in Great Britain differ with their counterparts in the motherland. I mean, what have you observed during the course of your research?
So the answer to that question, I suppose, is that in certain senses they are very, very close, and the fact that they are close is of importance to the people that participate in them. It is a way of connecting with one's home culture, one's home country. So certain aspects of the terminology, certain sort of episodes or sort of parts of the group meetings are identical. A lot of the kind of names of the office holders in the institution are the same. There's the same sort of flag ceremony at the beginning. So there are lots of, and some of the games that they play, for example, will be the same. The sorts of conversations, topics they might have might be similar as well. But, there are some quite key differences as well. One would be the setting in which they take place. This is not taking place, broadly speaking, kind of outdoors on patches of ground, across the country as they might do in India. These are taking place in kind of community centres or halls or even schools in Britain. They tend to happen less frequently, maybe only once a week, as opposed to more regular daily shakas. The other difference is quite a noticeable difference is what people are wearing. When I first started my research, the RSS uniform of India was famous for its sort of khaki shorts and white shirts, whereas overseas that wouldn't be the case. People would that was adapted, I think, to make it a little bit more appealing, perhaps. And some of the games are also different. So people might play football and so on in a shaka, which definitely would not have taken place in India. In fact, some of the sort of founding figures of the RSS were very, very much against sort of Western sports like football and even cricket as well. So there are some quite key differences there. And I think one final thing that's worth mentioning is a kind of pedagogical difference. So they're often spaces in which people are learning about a culture that they're not being brought up in. And that's often why maybe parents would be keen to send their kids to these groups, because they're being acculturated in a particular, Hindu, a particular expression of Hindu culture that isn't available to them in their kind of everyday lives. Whereas, of course, a shaka in India is operating in a context in which that culture surrounds the people that attend it.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners, thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out.
I want to kind of bring us now to this kind of pivotal moment. And it's a moment that I talked about a couple of weeks on the show with another historian, Srinath Raghavan, his new book on Indira Gandhi, which is The Emergency. One of the things you point out in your book, Ed, is that the literature on Hindu nationalism's engagement with the diaspora largely dwells on the period since the 1980s. So, 1980s up until the present. But you argue in your book pretty persuasively that the emergency was actually a very important inflection point, in part because it was a transformative movement for the Hindu nationalist movement more generally. And I'm wondering if you could just kind of zero in a bit on, how was the emergency's impact felt specifically among the diaspora?
The diaspora certainly were significantly impacted by the emergency. It was a point of time that was very important to them in many different ways. Obviously, by this point, there's a kind of critical mass of Indian migrants overseas, particularly in Britain, but also the diaspora in America is growing at this point as well, and various other parts of the world too. And there's a couple of reasons why the diaspora felt particularly sort of affected by the emergency. One is that this was a period of time in which various different groups, organizations, political rivals to Indira Gandhi were being suppressed and even banned in India, including the RSS and the Jan Sangh. And as I mentioned earlier, the Hindu nationalist groups had started to be established in various parts of the Indian diaspora at this point. And so these groups were able to kind of respond to the fact that they had been banned in India. And they saw themselves as having an important role in which they could lobby, in which they could sort of express concern in a way that people in India might not have been able to at this point in time. And this was also supported by people moving around as well. So there was a number of influential people, Hindu nationalists and people on the left as well, who were targeted during the emergency that managed to get out of India and would travel around groups in the diaspora and sort of wider sort of communities of people, trying to kind of raise awareness of the sort of the awful things that were happening during the emergency and the sharp decline of democracy that had been taking place. So the diaspora sort of saw this as a moment when, or at least many people did, when they could actually sort of have a positive impact on India and support people who were in India living under what they considered to be a form of dictatorship.
You know, one of the people who pops up in this section of the book is none other than Narendra Modi, who is quoted in your book as referring to the emergency as providing him with a wonderful opportunity, quote unquote. This is a bit of an aside, but it is kind of intriguing. What would we know about Modi's influence and interactions during this period of the emergency?
Yes, so it's obviously quite striking that Modi does refer to this as a wonderful opportunity. But actually, that's in keeping with a lot of people from the BJP and the Hindu Nationalist movement more broadly. The emergency is a period which is invoked very often by these sorts of Congress opponents as a moment where they're on the right side of history, as resisting the kind of dictatorship of Indira Gandhi, as they would frame it, and sort of standing up and rescuing India's democracy from a period of considerable decline, where it was really in peril for lots of reasons. Of course, this was a period of authoritarianism, of many people being incarcerated without trial or even charge. It was a period in which numerous organizations were banned and the press were very much restricted, and freedom of expression was restricted in broader terms as well. So these were certainly dark days for Indian democracy. And it's a point in time in which the RSS and the Jan Sangh, the kind of precursor to the BJP, were amongst those groups that were banned, but there were also, communists and other groups on the left that were also targeted by Indira Gandhi during this period. So what was Narendra Modi involved in? Well, what we know about this is from a few things he's written and said, and also a book that he published initially in Gujarati about Gujarat during the emergency. And in this, he describes his sort of experiences. He is at this point a pracharak, a full-time worker of the RSS, I believe, with the ABVP. And so, like other members of the RSS, he's going underground to avoid arrest. And one of the roles that he describes in the book is involved with coordinating activism, coordinating sort of contact, rather, with people outside of India, including the political leader Makarand Desai, who is in England at this point. And he described, and there's a few letters pertaining to this, sort of getting information out of India, where press freedom is heavily restricted. So getting information out of India that could be circulated amongst members of the diaspora, particularly the Gujarati diaspora in Britain and elsewhere. And then those members of the diaspora could attempt to sort of contact journalists to try and spread the word about all of the kind of excesses of Indira Gandhi at this time, and the decline in democracy. And then some of those stories would then be kind of compiled into these sort of DIY publications, which would then be sent back to India and then circulated around India. So this is one of the ways in which Modi says that he was mobilizing resistance to the emergency during this period. And this follows, as I said, a sort of fairly common narrative. This is something that that people are quite eager to talk about whenever you have a kind of anniversary, a kind of commemoration of the emergency on particular sort of anniversaries. It is often members of the BJP that are quite vocal in talking about it, because it's a period in which they see themselves as being on the right side of history, of kind of saving India's democracy from this very dark period, ushered in by a suspension of democracy by Indira Gandhi.
Just kind of trying to tie a few strands together here. One of the points that you make in the book is that, look, there were many foreign centers of Sangh activism where you saw a kind of deeply embedded Hindu nationalist kind of ethos thrive in the diaspora. But you said of all of those foreign centers of such activism, Britain was arguably the most important. And I was struck by that, because I think a lot of us today, maybe it's because I'm an American, we tend to kind of have our own biases, tend to think of Sangh activism being so prevalent in America. But you make the case actually that Great Britain, in some sense, has more of a hub. Tell us a little bit about, how you think about that particular contrast.
Sure. Of course, I'd hate to suggest that America isn't the center of the world, but I suppose the point that I was making was really a historical one. So the Sangh itself, the RSS, it was established in Britain more than 2 decades before any branches emerged in the US. Actually, it was only that kind of cap on Indian migrants that was lifted, cap on Indian migrants to the US, that was lifted around the time that the Sangh was established in Britain, by which point there's a very substantial Indian population in the UK. So, America, things are only really getting started in terms of an Indian diaspora over there. So yeah, institutionally, America is somewhat behind Britain in that respect. And obviously there are historical connections between Britain and India, which account for kind of more influence and a kind of closer sort of set of links as well. I think, in the present day, a claim could probably be made the other way around. There are certainly more shakas in the US. There's a much bigger Indian diaspora in the US than there is in the UK. At least, numerically speaking. As a percentage of the population, it's actually not so substantial. And obviously, the Indian diaspora in America is distinctive. They are considered influential, partly due to, significant financial clout and more recently roles in politics and other important areas. And, I think, for India, certainly that US relationship is considered more consequential. So the kind of the aspect of lobbying, the aspect of trying to, the advocacy role that Indians can play on behalf of the BJP and Hindu nationalist groups in America is more important, I suppose, than in Britain or in any other country for that matter. But yeah, the point I suppose I was making in the book was that historically speaking, certainly in the 60s and 70s, Britain is more important to the Hindu nationalist movement than America, I would say.
This leads us to the kind of broader question of kind of, transnationalism and global Hindutva. Yeah, I was really struck by your statement, and it comes up in one or two places, that the significance of the Indian diaspora to the Hindu nationalist movement in India is oftentimes more symbolic than material. For instance, a lot of people like to talk about the fundraising that these entities do at the time of elections or otherwise through the RSS and its overseas affiliates. You come away with that saying, that might be there, but it's probably been exaggerated, and that funding and financial flows are probably not the kind of preeminent or most important aspect of this relationship. I wonder if you could just kind of elaborate on that for us.
Sure. So I think I would still support that idea that that the sort of symbolic rather than material significance of diasporic support is greater. There has been attention and interest and significant concern over fundraising taking place for Hindutva groups, Sangh groups, charities related to Hindu nationalist sort of ideologies, and political funding from overseas as well. And this forms, up until relatively recently, a significant proportion of things that had been written. In fact, still today, really, a significant proportion of things that have been written about Hindu nationalism come from a kind of activist perspective, an anti-Hindutva perspective, trying to sort of highlight the perceived threats and sort of concerns around Hindu nationalism outside India. So a lot of that has focused on fundraising. That being said, it's often quite a difficult thing to quantify, particularly when it comes to, as you know, political funding. It's very hard to actually, get to the bottom of things and actually figure out how much funding is coming from overseas. The other point to make, and this might seem like an obvious one, but there's a lot of money. Particularly in the last few decades, there's a lot of money in India, and there are a lot of people in India. And so in terms of like an actual contribution to the running costs of various organizations or political parties, the lion's share of that is going to be achievable in India, particularly if you look at the kind of support that the BJP have got from very wealthy people in recent years as well. So in that sense, I don't know whether, I think that any argument that suggests that Hindutva groups are kind of reliant on funding from overseas, I can't really see there being a strong case for that. However, having the kind of symbolic support from overseas is clearly important. Packing out stadiums, seeing, tens of thousands of members of the Indian diaspora supporting the BJP, or maybe their roles in supporting certain policies, or things like, let's say, the Ram Temple in Ayodhya, supporting that in a digital space, that can be quite influential, providing a kind of advocacy role. And it's also symbolically important for the diaspora itself to feel like they're part of something there. That's definitely influential. I mentioned also packing out sort of stadia for like rallies, obviously the ones that Modi has presided over in places like Madison Square Garden, in that football stadium, I think in Texas, in stadiums in Australia, and Wembley Stadium in the UK in 2015 as well. These are a kind of, probably the most visually arresting expressions of Hindu nationalism overseas. The people that are participating in this are creating quite powerful images to be used back in India. They're probably not voters. Very few members of the Indian diaspora vote. Those that have taken the citizenship of other countries, of course, can't vote. But even those that remain Indian citizens, NRIs, it's very difficult, logistically for those people to actually use their vote. So I think rather than, using that vote at the ballot box, there is a kind of symbolic way in which they can provide influence, which perhaps is more substantial, more greater in influence than that one vote might be.
Towards the end of the book, you write that Hindu nationalism, particularly again in the diaspora, has really kind of outgrown the institutional and ideological boundaries of the Sangh. And when pointing to this fact, you also talk about the emergence of something called a neo-Hindutva, which was a new term for me. I'm wondering if you could just help define what neo-Hindutva is, and maybe just give us a sense of organizations which kind of exist beyond the Sangh, which have become very influential in their own right, but technically kind of outside of that traditional sort of RSS ecosystem.
Mm. Yeah, much of our conversation today is focused on the Sangh, and in many ways, they are, well, in many ways they are very much at the very center of the ideology and the movement that we're speaking about. But there certainly have been a wide range of other institutions that can be connected to Hindu nationalism, but perhaps don't have that obvious or sort of explicitly stated institutional connection to the Sangh Parivar, but still are very much ideologically aligned with Hindutva. And that's something that I've tried to understand through this idea of neo-Hindutva, which I think I first wrote about around a decade ago. And I think that this is something that's particularly interesting in the diaspora, where we see groups that sort of set themselves apart from the Sangh, particularly in a kind of multicultural context, that frame themselves as community representatives, that maybe frame themselves in much less political terms, that are able to kind of operate using the language of multiculturalism as representatives of the community, and that perhaps are kind of framing themselves as much less political, but in fact, beneath the surface, what we can identify there is some key tropes of Hindutva ideology. And so, in that sense, Hindu nationalism has really kind of outgrown these institutional boundaries. I mean, I said earlier, we've been speaking about the Sangh for a long time. It's very interesting that shakas of the Sangh exist in America and in Britain, but in terms of the number of people that are actually attending these, it's a tiny fraction of the Indian diaspora as a whole. So what I'm interested in, I suppose, is thinking more broadly about the way in which the ideology has very much outgrown, has sort of permeated much more widely into the diaspora beyond these sort of conventional institutional structures.
Ed, just one final point before we end. I mean, one of the things you point out in the book is that, there have been a lot of observers out there who have argued that, look, the most passionate Hindu nationalist advocates that one finds, say, in a place like Britain, are newer migrants who arrive in recent times, I guess on the presumption, I should say, that these are people who have been exposed to kind of hegemonic Hindu nationalism in the kind of post-2014 era under Narendra Modi. Is this something that you observed yourself when you kind of look out? I mean, I know obviously this is something that's very difficult to collect data on, but just wondering impressionistically, do you see this correlation between kind of newer migrants, those who may have come to Britain, say, in the last 10 or 15 years, and a kind of intensity of feeling towards the Hindu nationalist cause?
I think there's certainly something in that. It does seem to be the case that people that have kind of grown up in this, new India, this India in which secularism is in decline, and much more sort of bolder forms of Hindutva are kind of become much more commonplace, a kind of saffronization of India. That people that have a kind of first-hand experience of that may bring with them a rather bolder and more assertive form of identity than people that perhaps have either lived abroad for many decades or in fact were born and brought up abroad. Because I mean, the context is obviously different, right? I mean, this kind of brings us back to a kind of irony or a tension of Hindutva that we've discussed from the very start, which is that Hindutva is majoritarian. It's an ideology which is premised around the idea that that a particular part of the world should be run by and in the interests of the majority community, who, depending on how you enumerate it, can perhaps be perhaps 80 or more % of the population being Hindu in India. Whereas in the diaspora, when you move to the diaspora, you're part of a much smaller minority. Where you are a minority, you're part of a small minority. And, in the early days of the Indian diaspora overseas, and still to a large extent to this day as well, what you see is people of South Asian origin, mixing much more, when there were smaller numbers of people. I mentioned earlier that I think you mentioned earlier, in fact, that in the early 70s, I think there was only 2 Hindu temples in the UK. There was a much less of a sort of institutional, organizational sort of structures and so on. So people would mix a lot more freely. in that period. And actually, it's only in more recent decades that you can see a lot more kind of ring fencing and a lot more emphasis placed on religious identity over kind of broader ethnic or cultural forms of identity. And so, yeah, I think there is certainly a case to be made that you know that people that have moved more recently have been are kind of expressing a different form of Hindutva, perhaps. But I think that, you know, we can't only frame it as a kind of recent shift. And actually, as I think I argue in the book, you know, Hindu nationalism and its ideology is something that has developed and evolved and grown in the diaspora for many, many decades.
My guest on the show this week is Edward Anderson. He's assistant professor in history at Northumbria University in Newcastle. He's author of the fabulous book, Hindu Nationalism in the Indian Diaspora, Transnational Politics and British Multiculturalism. It was selected by The Economist as one of only 6 books that they recommend if you would like to get a handle on Hindutva, what it is, how it spreads its influence, where it's come from, where it's going. Edward, this was a delightful conversation. You know, learned so much from your book. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks. I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you very much.
Granthamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Granthamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granthamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.